Greetings, scholars. We're beginning our review here for APUSH Unit 13, and I'm looking in your review guide for question 1. How successful were the programs of the New Deal in solving the problems of the Great Depression? Assess with respect to two of the following. And the classic R's here are relief, recovery, and reform. Well, as far as relief, that refers to giving immediate help to those in need. Now keep in mind here, I'm going to go through a bunch of these programs here, and so there's some fluidity. Where you're giving a job to somebody, you might be providing relief, but you might also be working towards recovery. So it depends on how you define it. The AP just wants you to come up with some analysis and to justify it. But the key thing is you know these programs. So the PWA is the Public Works Administration. The WPA is the Works Progress Administration, and the CWA is the Civil Works Administration. And there's a lot of redundancy between these agencies, but basically the point is to give people jobs, building federal buildings, building post offices, building sidewalks. Some of these programs will be building some naval ships. We'll be building tunnels. We'll be building bridges, things like this. But a lot of job programs for the unemployed. The CCC is the Civil Conservation Corps, very popular program, putting young men in the woods, planting trees, fighting forest fires, building nature, picnic shelters, and things like that, trails. The TVA is, you could argue that it's it's reform, putting the government in the business of providing cheap electricity, but building dams also did give jobs. The Tennessee Valley Administration, which is building dams in Appalachia for the purpose of providing cheap electricity to draw in industry, economic development, to prevent flooding, and maybe a secondary reason would be also to provide some recreational areas. The FERA is the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which gave out money, which was a little bit controversial here. HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The NYA, the National Youth Administration, giving jobs to young high school, college students. The FSRC, the Federal Surplus Relief Corporation, giving out things like salt pork and potatoes and extra food and corned beef and whatnot. Recovery, getting the economy back on its feet by creating employment. The FDIC, although primarily reform, it encouraged people to put money back into and to keep their money in banks, and such capital was needed for recovery. The SEC is the Securities Exchange Commission, which is a watchdog for the stock market. The National Labor Relations Board is the NLRB. The Wagner Act okayed the formation of unions, labor unions. Social Security is going to be a system for unemployment and disability, but primarily long-term it's going to provide old age pensions for the elderly. Fair Labor Standards Act will set up maximum hours and minimum wage. The NIRA Section 7A is going to also okay unions, and this is before the Wagner Act. The Glass-Steagall Banking Act is going to separate the risky investment banking from safer commercial banks. The Revenue Act of 1935 will anticipate the repeal of prohibition, and this will be a tax on beer and wine. And one of the things the Congress will do is we'll redefine intoxicating beverages. That 3.2% beer doesn't count as intoxicating beverage, and they'll begin taxing this. AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, will give money to farmers to not plant their crops. What was the second New Deal? After FDR's reelection, his programs became more focused on permanent change than on temporary fixes, it could be argued. This change of direction was influenced by the Roosevelt recession. In 1937, Roosevelt will cut back some of the money on his programs as the economy picks up compared to when he came in 1932, and there's going to be a nosedive here. The government will become, the economy will become dependent on the government to provide money to through the New Deal programs. His large re-election mandate is going to give him the confidence that he can be more aggressive, and there's anger at a conservative Supreme Court, and there's also reaction to extremist critics on the side, people sniping at him like Francis Townsend and Charles Coughlin, the radio priest, and Huey Long down in Louisiana. Some of the second New Deal programs that are meant to be permanent and not temporary. A lot of these programs that he has here, giving young guys jobs in the woods, the CCC and Civil Works and Public Works Administration, these things are meant to stop once the Depression is over. But the National Labor Relations Board, the Wagner Act, Social Security, Fair Labor Standards Act, these things are meant to be long-term and meant to be permanent. Question 3, analyze the ways in which the Great Depression altered the American social fabric in the 1930s. Well, you can use the information above that we just went over. Also, you can talk about, I have on the bottom here, you need to be familiar with John Steinbeck, who is going to be writing about the need for worker solidarity and sort of brotherhood during the Great Depression. His most famous book is The Grapes of Wrath. And you should be familiar with some of these extremists. Huey Long, who's the governor of Louisiana, who has the Share the Wealth program and the slogan, Every Man a King. Francis Townsend is pushing for old age pensions. This will be adopted by Franklin Roosevelt in his Social Security. And Charles Coughlin, who's this agitator radio priest. Question 4, identify 3 of the following measures below and how they attempted to create a more stable economy. And you have here the Agricultural Adjustment Act, you have the Securities Exchange Commission, you have the Wagner Labor Relations Act and Social Security Act. These things have been addressed earlier. I'm just noting in question 1, we didn't talk about reform. I didn't put that in the review book here, and that's my error to omit that. But the big difference here is, remember, relief is providing immediate work for somebody. Recovery is something meant to get the economy back on its feet, and reform is sort of preventive measures to keep the economy from collapsing. And the big thing you need to know for the recovery is the NRA, the National Recovery Act, is meant to give a green light to businesses to set up codes, to set up, in a sense, to get around anti-monopoly laws. The economy's flat on its back here, and the purpose here is to allow businesses to meet, to get together, and to do what is necessary to revive the economy. And this will be struck down by the Supreme Court later on during Roosevelt's second term. Question 5, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was commonly thought of as a liberal, and Herbert Hoover is thought of as a conservative. To what extent are these characterizations valid? This was actually a DBQ, and the documents were set up in such a way that you would see that Roosevelt had a conservative side, and Hoover, in many ways, at the time was considered to be kind of radical. As a generalization, this characterization is true, but Hoover intervened more than previous presidents by setting up the RFC, and that's the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This does continue in the Roosevelt administration, and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation is kind of a trickle-down organization, giving money to insurance companies, to banks, to railroads, to businesses. The idea is that if they keep their doors open, they will continue to provide jobs, although Hoover was very reluctant to help the individual. Hoover did, though, encourage giving to private charities and encouraged big business to keep wages up and not to fire workers. Hoover hoped for the economy to right itself. The bonus army in Washington was attacked under Hoover. The shanties burned, and the bonus was denied. And the beating up of these vets takes place under MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, but Hoover will take the rap. He will take the blame here. The Holly-Smoot tariff will jack up tariffs on imports, will keep foreign goods out from competition, and there will be retaliation by the Europeans. Some historians, who are economic historians, point to this essentially a trade war here, putting walls up against our what would be our natural trading counterparts as one more reason why the Depression takes place and drags on. Also, FDR did initially cut the pay of government workers. There's an Economy Act where he slashes pay by 15%. And after the re-election of 1936, FDR cut government spending and caused what is called the Roosevelt recession. Unemployment will jump from 14% back up to 19%. And manufacturing will fall 40%. So FDR didn't really realize how much the economy needed this new infusion that the New Deal was giving. Question 6, compare and contrast basically the progressive era with the New Deal. Remember, the New Deal's programs are designed to rescue a sinking economy during a depression. FDR's problems were unemployment and lack of industrial production. Progressivism, on the other hand, occurred during an economic boom and was designed to limit the power of big business and to protect the rights of workers and consumers. Progressivism also had a political component designed to increase accountability and political participation. Some examples here. Limits on big business and on the wealthy. The Hepburn and Elkins Act limited railroad rates and rebates. The Clayton Act limited monopolies and trusts and allowed workers to create unions. Well, that's one point of commonality with the New Deal, the Clayton Act. The Sherman Act earlier allowed the breakup of monopolies, but had been used against labor unions. Teddy Roosevelt broke up Standard Oil, which is Rockefeller's oil company, and Northern Securities, which was J.P. Morgan's railway company. Wilson created the Federal Reserve Act to bring stability to the banking system. One parallel here would be the FDIC under Roosevelt. There is, under the Progressives, an income tax amendment. States will pass workers' comp on the state level. There will be a Pure Food and Drug Act, a Meat Inspection Act. Teddy does intervene in the anthracite coal strike on the side of the striking miners, and this is similar to Section 7A of the National Recovery Act under FDR and later the Wagner Act. There is the creation of a Department of Labor. There's tariff reform under Wilson. That's the Underwood tariff. Contrast here is tariffs were jacked up during the New Deal. Smoot-Hawley sees tariffs as something benefiting industry, whereas Woodrow Wilson is going to see high tariffs something benefiting the very privileged, wealthy factory owners. The ICC is the Interstate Commerce Commission, which originally will regulate railroad rates and telegraph rates, but later this will be used to regulate things like telephone rates, pipelines, and it's going to be used for transportation, buses and planes down the road. But the ICC is going to be regulating anything that falls under the idea of interstate trade. FTC, Federal Trade Commission, is going to be looking for fraud, look for deception in business. The progressive increase of political participation, you can point to the direct election of senators, that women can vote, secret ballots, initiative, referendum, and recall. These last things here, secret ballots and the initiative, referendum, and recall, are on a state level. Why does socialism fail to become a major force in American politics? That's question 7 here. You can point to progressivism. Progressivism is that kind of in between, rather than laissez-faire, anything goes, and rather than socialism where the government takes over the business. The idea of the progressives is to limit business. The only businesses that would get busted up are super big monopolies, at least under Teddy Roosevelt. But otherwise, the idea is to limit profit, to limit and to regulate a business rather than to dismantle it. And to discuss unionism, the unions you need to know, the AFL, the big skilled worker, trade worker, craft worker union, and the CIO is the union that will pick up speed during the New Deal. Once the Wagner Act is passed, the CIO explodes in size. This is the Congress of Industrial Organizations. This is a union of all workers in a factory, and the AFL-CIO is now a single union, but this is in particular a significant union during the New Deal period. In question 8, I don't have any blanks here for you to fill out. This says, analyze the responses of Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration to the problems of the Great Depression. Hey, here's where you need that arsenal of 10, 12, 15 New Deal responses, this alphabet soup. You should know the WPA, and the PWA and the CWA and the NYA and the AAA and the NRA and the FDIC. You just need to know them, and you need to be able to explain them and what they did. And this question here, this was a DBQ, gave you some documents, but they wanted you to know about the changing role of the federal government. Keep in mind, the AP does not want you to make a judgment whether this was stupid or whether this was wise or whether, this was a plot by socialists or anything like that. They're not looking for that. They're looking for just objectively, how did the government change in the scope of its reach of its power, and did these programs work? And you could point to the Depression lasts all the way up until World War II. You could talk about there is a relative decrease in unemployment. Just be able to prove your point by pointing at some historical facts. And that's really all there is here for Unit 13. Signing off.